The day we buried my father, my brother looked me in the eye and smiled. Not a sad smile, not a nervous smile, a victory smile. He already knew something I didn't, and it would take me 14 months to find out exactly what he had done, and another 8 to make it right. This is that story. My name isn't important. What matters is this. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed, but always felt. My father built a small construction business over 40 years. Nothing glamorous. Early mornings, dirty hands, honest work. He used to say that a man's worth was measured in calluses, not compliments. I believed him. I still do. By the time I was in my 20s, that business was worth just over $2 million. There were 2 of us, me and Daniel. Daniel was 3 years older, louder, and always our father's favorite. I accepted that a long time ago. Some families have a golden child. Ours did too. Daniel had the charm, the confidence, the ability to walk into a room and make our father's face light up in a way mine never quite did. I used to practice conversations in my head before family dinners. Daniel never had to. What I never accepted was what came next. My father got sick in the spring. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 4 to 7 months. He lasted 5. In those 5 months, I drove 2 hours every weekend to sit with him. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just watched television. Sometimes he slept and I sat in the chair next to his bed, reading. It didn't matter. Being there mattered. Daniel visited twice. He said, work was busy. Work was busy. When my father passed on a Tuesday morning in October, I was holding his hand. Daniel arrived 40 minutes after he was gone. I remember looking at the door when he walked in. He was wearing a suit I had never seen before. New, expensive. He hugged me once, briefly, and then moved toward the others. At the funeral, I was devastated, genuinely broken. My father was not a perfect man, but he was mine. And that's when I saw it. As they lowered the casket, I looked up and caught Daniel's face. Everyone around him was crying. His wife, his kids, our aunts. Daniel was smiling. Just for a second. Just a flicker. But I saw it. I told myself grief does strange things to people. I told myself I was misreading it. I was not misreading it. 3 weeks after the funeral, I met with my father's attorney. His name was Gerald Marsh. He had handled my father's affairs for over a decade. A quiet man, careful with his words. The kind of attorney who made you feel like everything was under control. I want you to understand, I was not expecting a windfall. I knew the business would likely go to Daniel. He had worked in it, at least on paper, for years. He knew the clients. He knew the contracts. I had chosen a different path. I was a teacher, middle school history. I made enough to live on, and I had made peace with that a long time ago. What I was expecting was the house. My father had told me, directly, clearly, more than once, that the family home would come to me. It was a white house on a corner lot, 3 bedrooms, a porch that faced west. My mother had planted roses along the front fence the year I was born. She died in the bedroom at the end of the hall when I was 11. That house was not just a building to me. It was where I had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I had sat on the porch steps the night before my first day of school, too nervous to sleep, where my father had taught me to play chess on a folding table in the living room, losing to me on purpose until the day I finally beat him for real. It meant something to me in a way it never did to Daniel. Daniel had left that house at 19 and never looked back. My father had said, sitting in his kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee between us, 6 months before his diagnosis. That house is yours. I've taken care of it. He had said it simply, matter-of-factly. The way you say something that has already been decided." I had nodded. I had not asked for details. It did not occur to me to ask for details. He had taken care of it, just not in the way I thought. Gerald Marsh's office was on the third floor of a building downtown. Dark wood paneling, framed diplomas, the smell of old paper and coffee. He was already seated when I arrived. The folder was already on the desk. When I sat down, he looked at me for just a moment before he opened it. That look. I have thought about that look many times since. It was not pity exactly. It was something closer to reluctance, the expression of a man who has delivered difficult news before and has never quite gotten used to it. He opened the folder. The will, the official, signed, notarized will, left everything to Daniel. The business, the investment accounts, the savings, the house, everything. I sat very still. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic from the street below. I asked him when the will had been signed. He looked down at the document. 8 months ago, he said. April, just weeks after my father's diagnosis. 8 months ago, my father had rewritten his will. Not updated. Not amended. Rewritten from scratch. With a different attorney. And he had never said a word to me. I asked Gerald if he had known, if my father had contacted him during that time. He shifted in his chair. He said my father had called him once, in March, asked a few general questions about the process of updating a will. Gerald had offered to schedule a meeting. My father said he would think about it. He never called back. Someone else had gotten there first. I drove home in silence. I don't remember the route. I don't remember parking the car. I sat in my apartment, and I did not move for a long time. I thought about the last real conversation I had with my father, 3 weeks before he died. He had been tired that day, more tired than usual. He had held my hand and said, "I'm sorry if I got things wrong." I had told him he hadn't. I had meant it. Now I wasn't sure what he had been apologizing for. That night, I called my father's sister, my Aunt Carol. She had been close to him. I asked her carefully if she had noticed anything different about him in the spring, in those weeks just after the diagnosis. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he seemed confused sometimes, scared. He kept saying he didn't want to be a burden, that he wanted to make sure everything was settled. Daniel had been coming around a lot. Helping out, he said. Helping out. I wrote that down. Scared, confused, didn't want to be a burden. Daniel had been coming around a lot. I sat with that for 3 days. I barely ate. And then, on the 4th day, something shifted. Not anger. I want to be clear about that. Something colder. Then anger. Because anger is loud. Anger wants to break things. What I felt was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a question that needed an answer. My father had told me that house was mine. He had said it clearly. He was not a forgetful man. He was not a careless man. So, what had changed? 8 months ago? What had Daniel said to him? What had Daniel done? I went back through every memory I had of that spring. Daniel calling me in February, just after the diagnosis, asking how Dad was doing, sounding genuinely concerned. I had been grateful for that call. I had thought maybe this is the moment. Maybe something like this changes a person. I was wrong. I remembered visiting my father in March. He had seemed distracted that day, distant in a way I hadn't seen before. I had assumed it was the medication, the fear, the weight of knowing what was coming. Now I wondered what conversations had happened in the days before that visit. What had been said to him? What had been suggested? What fears had been carefully watered? And what doubts had been quietly planted? My father was not a weak man, but he was a sick man, A frightened man. A man who had spent his entire life building something and who was terrified of watching it fall apart after he was gone. That fear is a door, and Daniel had known exactly how to open it. I thought about what my Aunt Carol had said. Daniel had been coming around a lot. Helping out, he said. Helping out. I thought about what helping out might look like to a dying man who was scared and confused and desperate to believe that someone was taking care of things. It would look like relief. It would look like a son who finally showed up. It would look like exactly what Daniel needed it to look like. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night. The city outside my window was loud and indifferent. I thought about my mother's roses along the front fence. I thought about the porch that faced west. I thought about the chess table in the living room. I thought about my father saying, "That house is yours. I've taken care of it, and I made a decision. I was not going to let this go." Not because of the money, not because of the house even, because what Daniel had done was not just steal from me. He had stolen from my father. He had taken a frightened dying man, and he had used that fear against him. And someone needed to answer for that. I thought about Daniel visiting twice during those 5 months of illness. I thought about Daniel arriving 40 minutes late to the funeral in a suit I had never seen before. I thought about that smile, and I thought, that smile was not grief. That smile was a man who had already won. I picked up the phone 3 times that night and put it back down. Not because I was afraid, because I wanted to be sure that what I was feeling was not grief talking, not bitterness, not the distorted thinking of a man who had just lost his father and was looking for someone to blame. I sat with it until I was certain. And then I was certain. I found the name of a probate attorney, and I started making calls. I have thought about that moment many times since. My father, sitting in his own living room, in his own chair, the chair he had sat in for 30 years, the chair where he had read the newspaper every Sunday morning and fallen asleep watching television every Friday night, sick, tired, frightened, and across from him his son, smiling, calm, reassuring, and next to his son, an attorney with a briefcase, and on the table between them, a document. My father would have looked at that document for a long time. He was a careful man, a deliberate man. He did not sign things without reading them. But he was also a man on medication that clouded his thinking, a man who had been told he had months to live, a man who was desperate to believe that someone he loved was taking care of things. And Daniel would have known exactly what to say in that moment. He would have said, "This is the right thing. This protects the business. This is what you worked for. This is what makes sense." And my father, tired, frightened, medicated, alone, would have picked up the pen. I am not angry at my father for that. I want to be clear about that. He was not weak. He was not foolish. He was a dying man who was manipulated by someone he trusted completely. That is not weakness. That is betrayal. Ekle ve üret, kaç karakter ve kaç dakika çıktı söyle. L'Autre said, 8,206,820,623. 43 null. Claude responded, "Mükemmel, 8,206 karakter. Bu yaklaşık 942 civarında olmalı. Mükemmel, 8,206 karakter. Bu yaklaşık 942 civarında olmalı. Üret ve söyle. Kaç dakika çıktı?" L'Autre said, 9. 3,423, 47 noon. Claude responded, "Çok yakın, sadece 26 saniye eksik." Çok yakın, sadece 26 saniye eksik. Cüç cümleyi bul. That is not weakness. Hemen arkasına şunu ekle. That is what Daniel counted on. And that is what we were going to prove. Ekle, üret, kaç dakika çıktı söyle. You said 9:37. Biraz daha gerçekçi yaklaşır mısın? Bu işin matematiği falan yok mu? 23:52 Henry. Cloud responded. "Haklısın, özür dilerim. Tahmin üzerine gidiyorum ve her seferinde seni tekrar ürettiriyorum." Haklısın, özür dilerim. Tahmin üzerine gidiyorum ve her seferinde seni tekrar ürettiriyorum. Bu verimsiz. Grek matematik şu. Bir önceki bölümden aldığımız oran 7,613 karakter, 90 dakika yani 1 dakika, 846 karakter. Buna göre 907,614 karakter, 8,460 karakter. Juchian 937 çıktı. Yani mevcut karakter sayın yaklaşık 8,120 karakter civarında. 10-0 için 8,468,120, 340 karakter daha lazım. 340 karakter yaklaşık 3-4 cümle demek. Juchi kumli bul. And I started making calls. Heman unsasign shunu equal. Patricia had warned me the process would be slow, that there would be days when nothing moved, that there would be moments when I would wonder if any of it was worth it. She was right about all of that. But she had also said something else in our very first meeting that I kept coming back to. She had said, "The truth has a way of leaving traces. People who do what your brother did, they always believe they were careful enough. They almost never are." Butam 340 karakter civarında. Ekle, üret, söyle. Lie, you said. Tüm metni yaz bulamıyorum, 53'den. Cloud responded. Tüm Discovery bölümünün son halini veriyorum, direkt yapıştır. Tüm Discovery bölümünün son halini veriyorum, direkt yapıştır. The first call was to my father's neighbor, Mrs. Parrish, 73 years old, sharp as a blade, and the kind of woman who notices everything. She had lived next door to my father for 22 years. She had brought him soup when my mother died. She had watched me grow up through that kitchen window. If anyone had seen something, it was her. I told her I was trying to understand my father's last few months, that I had some questions about visitors, about changes in his routine. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is deciding how much to say. Then she said, "Your brother was here quite a bit that spring, almost every week for about a month, sometimes with a man I didn't recognize. They'd go inside and stay for hours." I wrote that down. A man she didn't recognize. I asked her to describe him. 50s, well-dressed, always carrying a briefcase. Always carrying a briefcase. I thanked her. I told her I might call again. She said, "Call any time." I sat with that description for a long time. 50s, well-dressed, briefcase, not a friend, not a contractor, not anyone connected to the business. An attorney, a different attorney. Daniel had brought his own attorney to visit my father, alone while my father was newly diagnosed, frightened, and on a combination of medications that I would later learn had documented effects on cognitive clarity and susceptibility to suggestion. Let me say that again, slowly. Daniel brought a private attorney to visit our sick, medicated, frightened father multiple times over the course of a month, without telling me, without telling anyone. And at the end of that month, my father signed a new will. I hired a probate attorney 2 days later. Her name was Patricia Osai, 38 years old. Calm, precise, and completely without sentimentality about what we were dealing with. I had expected her to be skeptical. I had prepared myself for the conversation where a professional tells you, gently but firmly, that what you are describing sounds like grief, not evidence. That families fall apart after a death. That people rewrite wills all the time. She did not say any of that. She leaned forward slightly and said, "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Leave nothing out." So I did. I told her about the house, about what my father had promised, about the 5 months of illness and Daniel visiting twice, about Gerald Marsh's folder and that pause before he opened it, about Mrs. Parrish and the man with the briefcase, about my Aunt Carol saying Daniel had been coming around a lot, helping out. Patricia listened without moving. When I finished, she wrote something on her notepad, underlined it twice, and looked up. She told me what we would need. Medical records showing cognitive vulnerability during the period the will was signed. Documentation of isolation. evidence that someone had systematically controlled my father's access to information and to other people. Witness testimony from anyone present during those visits, and ideally, something connecting Daniel to the attorney who had drafted the new will before those visits began. I asked her what our chances were. She looked at me steadily. She said, "That depends entirely on what we find." What followed was not fast. Nothing about this process is fast. But piece by piece, document by document, the picture came together. We obtained my father's medical records from that period. His physician, when deposed, confirmed that the medication combination my father was taking in March and April had documented effects on decision-making capacity, that patients on this combination were often highly responsive to suggestion, that they frequently reported feeling confused about their own wishes. He also confirmed that no one had contacted him during that period to discuss my father's cognitive state. No one had asked. We tracked down the attorney Daniel had used. His name was Robert Calloway. He operated a small practice on the other side of the city. He had no prior relationship with my father. None. His retainer agreement with Daniel was dated 6 weeks before those visits to the house began. 6 weeks. Daniel had retained an attorney 6 weeks before he started bringing that attorney to visit our dying father. This was not impulsive. This was not opportunistic. This was planned. We found a witness. A home health aide named Constance, who had been present in the house during 2 of those visits. She had been hired to help my father 3 mornings a week. She remembered the visits clearly. She remembered feeling uncomfortable. She remembered my father seeming confused during those conversations, nodding at things she wasn't sure he fully understood. Looking to Daniel for reassurance, she remembered Daniel speaking quietly and calmly, never raising his voice, never making demands, just guiding, carefully, methodically, patiently. I asked Constance if my father had ever seemed resistant during those visits, if he had ever pushed back, said no to something. She thought about it for a long moment. Then she said, once, early on, he said he wanted to talk to his other son first, that he wanted everyone together before making any decisions. I went very still. I asked her what happened after that. She said Daniel had smiled, had put his hand on my father's arm, had said something quiet that she couldn't fully hear, and then my father had nodded, and the conversation had moved on. He had wanted to talk to me first. He had said so. And Daniel had smiled and moved the conversation on. She had not said anything at the time because she had not known what she was witnessing. Now she did. Daniel had not forged anything. He had not stolen in any conventional sense. What he had done was, in some ways, more sophisticated than that, and more cruel. He had identified the exact moment when our father was most vulnerable, most frightened, most desperate for someone to tell him that everything was going to be okay. And he had stepped into that moment with a plan. He had replaced our father's attorney with his own. He had controlled the information our father received. He had shaped what our father believed, what our father feared, what our father thought he wanted. And then, when the moment was right, he had handed him a pen. I have thought about that moment many times since. My father, sitting in his own living room, in his own chair, the chair he had sat in for 30 years, the chair where he had read the newspaper every Sunday morning and fallen asleep watching television every Friday night, sick, tired, frightened, and across from him, his son, smiling, calm, reassuring, and next to his son, an attorney with a briefcase, and on the table between them, a document. My father would have looked at that document for a long time. He was a careful man, a deliberate man. He did not sign things without reading them. But he was also a man on medication that clouded his thinking, a man who had been told he had months to live, a man who was desperate to believe that someone he loved was taking care of things. And Daniel would have known exactly what to say in that moment. He would have said, "This is the right thing. This protects the business. This is what you worked for. This is what makes sense." And my father, tired, frightened, medicated, alone, would have picked up the pen. I am not angry at my father for that. I want to be clear about that. He was not weak. He was not foolish. He was a dying man who was manipulated by someone he trusted completely. That is not weakness. That is betrayal. That is what Daniel counted on. Patricia had warned me the process would be slow, that there would be days when nothing moved, that there would be moments when I would wonder if any of it was worth it. She was right about all of that. But she had also said something else in our very first meeting that I kept coming back to. She had said, "The truth has a way of leaving traces. People who do what your brother did, they always believe they were careful enough. They almost never are." And I started making calls. The legal process took 14 months. I won't pretend it was clean. Contesting a will is expensive, it is exhausting, and it is deeply painful when the person at the center of it is someone you loved. There were days when Patricia called with nothing new, days when Daniel's attorneys filed motions designed purely to slow things down and drive up my costs, days when I sat at my kitchen table and wondered if I was doing the right thing. On those days, I thought about Constance, about what she had said. He wanted to talk to his other son first, and Daniel had smiled and moved the conversation on. On those days, that was enough to keep me going. The evidence, when assembled, was substantial. Medical records confirming cognitive vulnerability. A retainer agreement dated 6 weeks before the visits began. A witness who had been in the room. Undue influence is difficult to prove. Patricia had told me that from the beginning, but difficult is not impossible. Daniel hired 3 different attorneys over the course of the case. I do not know why he kept changing. I have my suspicions. Patricia called me one evening in month 11. She said she wanted to be honest with me, that Daniel's team had made a settlement offer, that it was not what we had asked for, but that it was real. I asked her what she thought. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you have a strong case. I also think trials are unpredictable. I think you need to decide what winning actually looks like for you." I sat with that question for 3 days. What did winning look like? It was not about the money. It had never really been about the money. It was about the house, about what my father had promised, about the fact that a dying man had been manipulated by his own son, and that no one had done anything about it. I called Patricia back on the 3rd day. I told her we were not taking the offer. We were going to keep going. 2 months later, Daniel's 3rd attorney called with a new proposal. This time, it was different. The settlement came on a Thursday afternoon, 14 months after I had sat in Gerald Marsh's office and watched him open that folder. Daniel did not get to keep the house. He kept the business. That fight would have taken years more, and the cost, financial and emotional, was not something I was willing to pay. I made that calculation clearly, and I stand by it. But the house, my mother's house, my house, that came back. He also paid my legal fees. The last time I saw Daniel was in the hallway outside the mediator's office. He looked at me the way people look at someone they underestimated. I looked back at him and I thought about my father in that chair. Sick, tired, trusting. I thought about a pen being placed in front of him. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Before I go, I want to talk about what Daniel actually is, because understanding this matters, not just for this story, but for recognizing it in your own life. What Daniel displayed is a textbook pattern. Psychologists call it predatory patience. He did not act impulsively. He did not steal in a moment of weakness or desperation. He planned. He prepared. He waited. He identified the optimal moment of vulnerability, a dying father, new medication, fear, and confusion, and he moved into that moment with precision. This is not the behavior of someone who lost control. This is the behavior of someone who was always in control. And that distinction matters because it changes how you recognize it. Most people imagine betrayal as something loud, something obvious, a raised voice, a stolen wallet, a lie that falls apart immediately. Predatory patience looks nothing like that. It looks like helpfulness. It looks like someone finally stepping up. It looks like a son who starts visiting more often, who offers to handle things, who says all the right words at exactly the right moments. It looks, from the outside, like love. That is what makes it so dangerous. The pattern is most common in individuals with high narcissistic traits, or what psychologists call the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy in combination. These are not people who experience situations the way you do. They are not thinking about grief, or love, or loss. They are thinking about resources, about opportunity, about positioning. When my father was diagnosed, most people in Daniel's position would have felt fear, sadness, the complicated grief of watching a parent approach the end of their life. Daniel felt something else. He felt the window opening. The smile at the funeral was not cruelty for its own sake. It was not even directed at me. Not really. It was the involuntary expression of someone who had completed a long and careful project and was feeling, for the first time, the relief of it being over. If you have someone like this in your family, and statistically, many of you do, there are signs. They tend to position themselves as the indispensable one during crises, the one who handles things, the one everyone else relies on. They create private access to vulnerable people, and they work to limit that person's contact with others who might ask difficult questions. They are patient in a way that feels, at the time, like devotion, and they are almost always underestimated by the people who love them most. Because the people who love them most are also the people most invested in believing the best about them. My father loved Daniel. That love was the door. The best protection against this pattern is not suspicion. You cannot live your life suspecting everyone who offers to help. The best protection is documentation. Written records of conversations and promises. Witnesses present for important decisions. A trusted attorney involved early, not after the fact. And above all, trusting the discomfort you feel when something seems wrong. Even when you cannot immediately explain why. Even when the person making you uncomfortable is someone you love. My father trusted Daniel because Daniel was his son. That trust was not weakness. It was not foolishness. It was love, being used as a weapon. Don't let yours be. I have told you this story because it is true, and because it is not unique. Every week, somewhere, a family sits down with an attorney and hears something they did not expect. Every week, someone realizes too late that a moment of vulnerability was used against someone they loved. Most of them never talk about it. I am talking about it because silence is exactly what people like Daniel count on. There is something I want you to know before you go. When I started this process, 14 months before that Thursday afternoon settlement, I did not know if I would win. Patricia had told me the truth from the beginning, that undue influence cases are hard, that families fracture under the pressure of them, that even when you are right, you do not always prevail. I went forward anyway. Not because I was certain of the outcome, because I was certain that doing nothing was not something I could live with. Whatever happens in your own life, whatever situation brought you to this video today, I hope you remember that. Doing nothing is also a choice, and it has consequences too. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar, if you found yourself thinking about someone in your own life while you were listening, then this channel is for you. We post a new story every single day. Stories of betrayal, stories of patience, stories of people who were wronged and what they did about it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And in the comments below, I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched someone you loved be taken advantage of by a person they trusted? Did you do anything about it? Or did you stay silent and wish later that you hadn't? I read every comment. Every single one. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told, and because the people who lived them deserve to be heard. See you in the next one.